Hey friends, I'm Sya, and today I wanted to share with you 5 ways that you can build better components in Figma so that you can kickstart your 2023 off right and level up you and your team and the way that you work. So, what is a good component? What makes a good component? What problems does it solve for you and your teams? So components should be simple to understand and simple to use. So this means that they should be scalable, right? They should adapt to all of their use cases and sizes and literally be able to scale them appropriately. So make them responsive, and they should be able to get wider and smaller and account for these changes. They should be customizable. So again, they should kind of be able to fit all of the different needs of a design or a design system. Usually when you're talking about components, it's like a UI library or a design system. And most importantly, they should be opinionated. I've seen this a lot. Obviously, I've worked at agencies and I've worked in-house on many design systems, many designs in general. And one thing that I've definitely noticed over and over is a lack of consistency and a lack of opinions about how components should be built. So I want to caveat to say that there is a place and time, especially earlier in the process of designing. So when you're ideating or in like lower fidelity, obviously it doesn't make sense to be super strict about your components. But you should always be mindful of the cleanliness of your file. A lot of people will often say that there's a time when you just put your ideas out there and you don't worry about it, and then you can clean up after. When, let's be real, you don't really want to clean up after. Most people aren't going to go back after working on a project for 2 months and clean everything up, because it's going to be a huge task, especially if you've accrued a lot of design debt throughout the process. So with that said, let's figure out how to improve the way that we work in Figma and make better components from the start. So as I've mentioned, I've worked several years in a lot of different contexts on a lot of design systems and designs in general, and built design systems with code for real-life applications. And I want to share some of that experience with you to help you build better components and share some tips with you, including a big one at the end, which is tied to a really exciting announcement. All right, so let's get into number 1. The first one, and this is a little bit controversial, is to auto-layout everything. So I literally mean it. I personally, every time I build components and usually designs in Figma in general, I use auto layout for everything. I know it might seem like a lot, it might seem tedious, it might seem even impossible to some people, but I promise you, guarantee you that it is possible, especially nowadays with the option to make things absolute. It is 100% for sure possible to build every component, every design with auto layout. Okay, so with that said, why do we want to build with auto layout? That auto layout, the reason is really that auto layout makes us think like developers. It forces you to be really opinionated about how you build things and to think about how things actually behave and are set up, right? So a lot of times you might be inclined to, draw a frame, and now you need an image. So I'm just going to draw another frame in here, and then image in here, and then you need some text. So I'm just going to drop some text here. Hello world. Okay, and it looks pretty good. People often adjust it like this, and maybe you check the distance. But ultimately, that's not how components get built in real life, right? When you build a component, a developer is going to have to make decisions. And if you don't make those decisions for them by using auto layout and making sure that things scale and resize properly, and you're opinionated about how things are built, then they're going to have to make assumptions. And those assumptions are often going to lead to inconsistencies. They're going to lead to you having to go back and give them feedback and go back and forth on things that you could have solved off the bat by just building things in a more opinionated way. So what I have here is a bad component. And you can see that as I scale it, things don't really behave appropriately. This is obviously built to be bad. You could set constraints and everything like that. But ultimately, what we want to do is create a brand new component that scales appropriately. So let's do that. We got a frame. I'm going to call this good card. And then we'll give this frame auto layout and a padding of 16 pixels. And already you can see how I'm kind of making these decisions, right? This is something that a developer can take and literally just input in their code. Padding of 16 pixels. Perfect. So from here, I'm just going to take the image that already exists and pop it in here. And we'll just make this a fixed width and a fixed height, because that's what we have in Spotify. The height of 272. This should fill container. And then we're going to put some text in here. The war on cars. Great podcast, by the way. And more text. Alex Brooke. And I'll just copy the style here, and same for this. And then finally, I'll copy the style of this card. Oops. 16. And we'll make the spacing 12, I believe. No, the spacing is also 16. And then obviously we see that these two are a little bit too far apart, so I'm going to wrap these in a column as well. And I think the spacing here is 10. Yep. Okay, so now we've got a pretty decent component, but we have the same problem. You know, the image is scaling. It's not perfect, obviously, but the text is not behaving appropriately. And this is where we can start to be opinionated about the way that things are built. So for starters, I can make this fill container, and then I can go in and make both of the texts fill container. So now we're starting to see a little bit more about, you know, an actual responsive behavior. Things are resizing and behaving the way that we want them to. However, I want to take this a step further, and actually this text should start to truncate at a certain point. So now that we have it at full width, I'm also going to set this resizing to truncate. And then this one is actually going to be 2 lines, and we're going to set it to truncate from here. Cool. So now if I have, say, and the war on cars as my second kind of author of this podcast, we can now see that as I resize this, this truncates, which is exactly the behavior that we'd actually expect, right? So things are truncating, there's 2 lines, and if we head over to Spotify, to my home, you can see, hopefully, yeah, that's kind of how things behave, right? There's a maximum of 2 lines here, and after that it expands. And is there a longer playlist name? Maybe not. Here we go. And then the first one is only a maximum of 1 line. So again, as designers, we want to make these decisions, right? We do want to have an opinion about how these things are built in production. And so why not bake that right into your components? So that was point 1. And just to show you kind of what I mean, I've actually gone in and built these components out in Svelte, and we'll come back to these as we go through these points. But you can see here kind of what I've mentioned, right? So we have here a column with a padding of 16 and a gap of 16. And if we go into our card, we can see that our padding is also 16, or 1 rem. And then our gap is also 1 rem. Our width and height, you know, everything kind of matches 1-to-1. That's really our ideal state, is for design and code to be as close as possible. All right, so let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is to avoid using shape elements. This is a really huge pet peeve of mine, especially when it comes to things like backgrounds and so on. So you'll often see components that are set up like this, where the background is just a random rectangle with a size. So it's not the end of the world, but again, we're running into issues with like resizing. You have to make sure that this has the appropriate resizing set. So if we go back to the base component, the resizing needs to be set to left and right, and now it kind of scales appropriately. Same thing goes with, you know, when you need a circle. Say you need a circle for some reason in your app, and people will just, you know, do O and draw like a circle shape, which now means that we can't do much to it, right? We can't change the border radius. A lot of times you'll see circles used for things like profile pictures or other sections of your UI that need a circle, but then it's not flexible. You don't have the same flexibility. You can't put things inside this circle, right? This can't wrap other things, which then leads you to you doing things like masks. So we want this image to be a circle, right? A lot of times people will put this here, and then, you know, they'll make this into a mask, and the order is backwards. And again, just one of my worst pet peeves. This didn't work because it's not an image. Another point of why you shouldn't use shapes. So what can we do? Well, for starters, code doesn't have shapes. I mean, we do in SVGs and things like that, but realistically, if you're going to make the background of this div, which is what we use in code instead of frames, a color, you're not going to put a rectangle in it. You're just going to take the div and give it a background color, right? 10%. That's going to make things way easier, and it's also going to mean that whoever uses your component doesn't have to go hunting for the thing that's making the background a certain color. They can just click on the div and see, okay, well, this needs to be a little bit brighter. I can do that right there. Same goes with circles. If you want to make a circle, just take a frame, give it a really high border radius, and you've got yourself a frame that you can now put things into, right? You can put text in here. You can take another image and put it in here, right? You just have a lot more flexibility without really having to give up anything from the circle. There is a caveat to this. Yeah, the caveat to this is when you need to create more unique shapes. So Halo Lab does that a lot, where they'll have like a shape that's sort of like this, and then they go in and add some points, and now you have this like kind of folder shape for your items. You obviously can't do that with just like a pure frame in Figma. So in these cases, it makes sense to do that. Also, if you're doing illustration or icons or anything like that, you obviously want to use shapes. But most of the applications I see for shapes being used are just simple UI elements that don't need to be shapes and that end up being clunkier and more difficult to use because of these overly nested shapes. And that leads me to my next point, which is to avoid unnecessary nesting. Again, something that I run into a lot and causes me a lot of frustration and the people I work with a lot of frustration is just something like this, where there's a ton of nesting. You see on the left here, we have our text is wrapped in a group, and then inside this group, there's another group wrapping the text, and so on. And it just makes things a lot more difficult. Say I want to fix this element. Okay, well, I want this to resize. I can go in here and make this left and right. Perfect. I'm good, right? Well, I guess this works because it's a group, but then you would have to go up and make this also left and right. And then you have to go up and make this also left and right. And it just becomes really confusing and frustrating. So again, just try to be mindful of how you nest things, because when you put things into groups and those groups aren't doing anything, you're just making it a lot harder for somebody else to come in and understand how your component is set up. So be very mindful of that. You can see here a very simple take. We just have text. That text is in a frame, and this frame is doing something. The reason it exists is to lower this gap to 10 pixels. And then up here, we have a gap of 16 pixels. So simplify things, reduce the amount of nested components, remove the amount of grouping and framing, and really you shouldn't really be using groups, which is point number 4. Don't use groups. Groups only really have one purpose in Figma, and it's to wrap illustrations. In every other possible use case, groups are a worse experience. They cause unwanted bugs. They have odd properties to them that we really don't want in here. For example, why is the fill of this group controlling the text, right? I mean, I guess it makes sense because a group is just grouping its child layers, but it's really confusing and it doesn't really make a lot of sense for a group to control properties of its children. It's just wrong. And again, groups don't provide a lot of advantages, but they do provide a lot of drawbacks. For example, groups don't have auto layout. So if I want to apply auto layout, well, I'm going to convert it to a frame anyways. And as I mentioned, groups kind of do weird things to their children and they resize. And there again, a really good use case is illustration or anything where you kind of want to frame around the things that you're drawing to be kind of sized properly. But in every other case, I beg you, use frames. I promise you it'll make your life a lot easier. As we said, you want to use auto layout for everything. So don't even bother with Command G to group things. If you want to put two things together, text 1 and text 2. Get in the habit of just hitting Shift A. These are now stacked properly. We can control the way that they're stacked with our panel here. And we're going back to point 1, just being very opinionated about how we build things. Okay. And the final point here is to create a shared API with your engineers. This one is a little bit harder. It's not always going to be perfect. But again, it's going back to thinking like an engineer, thinking like a developer, which we want to do. We want to bridge that gap. There's a lot of animosity, I think, on the internet and on Twitter. A lot of people will lead you to believe that designers and developers are mortal enemies. But really, we want to work together. We want to bridge that gap as much as possible. It's going to make you happier. It's going to make your developers happier. It's going to make your stakeholders happier when you save a lot of time and things look great. And actually, a lot of folks are now hiring hybrid roles. So if you're a designer in 2023, you'll see a lot of job postings like this one. Let me open it up here. You'll see Linear is hiring a product designer who works closely with engineers and other partners to ensure high quality implementation, redefine best-in-class software design and development processes. So they expect you to kind of be in this middle ground and to be able to share and to be able to speak a shared language with developers. You see here, building an opinionated product. Again, we don't want to just throw things out on a canvas. We want to be opinionated about how things work, how things look, and why they do look and work that way. And finally, you see that not a requirement, but in what is valued is experience with design systems, programming, and using technical tools. And just one example of many roles that I've seen out there that expect you to have some knowledge of development or straight up be a designer who codes. So do yourself a favor, learn to talk to your engineers, and learn to build a shared API with your engineers. So what do I mean by a shared API? Well, let's take a look at this component. So I'm going to turn this into a component, and using component properties, I'm going to start to create an API for this component. So there are really two key pieces of information here. That is our first one here, which is our title, and then our second piece of text here, which is our authors. And what happens here is that if we go to inspect our component, we see that our properties called title and authors. Let's go back to Svelte to see how I built this component, where you can see that I'm exporting a couple of props here. The first one is title, same thing, right? The second one is authors, again, same thing. And then we have a cover URL, which doesn't really apply to Figma because we can just use images. And then when a developer uses this component, they're going to actually go in and fill these props out, title, author, and so on. And we can do other things. For example, we can go in here and maybe make it so that this layer is toggleable, and we'll say has authors, right, which is either true or false. And I don't want it to show the authors. I can just toggle this off. And if we go back to our spec panel, we'll see that this prop called has authors has the value of false. Now, as a developer, I can go in and, again, kind of use that shared API to create my component. We'll have has authors equals true by default. And here we can see that if I go into a component and say has authors equals false, and then I'm just going to wrap these in an if statement. There are different ways of doing this. I'm just taking this approach. So if has authors equals true, we'll show this description. Let's end the if block. And you can see here I've got some my components. And if I go into the component and turn has authors to be false, we'll see that these have been turned off. We'll see that these don't have a description anymore. And again, our API matches exactly what we see in Figma. So if a developer is inspecting your designs and trying to figure out what they need to do, they have this handy little properties panel where they can copy your designs one-to-one. The same goes for a component like this. You know, we might have this first one be title, and then this will be our authors. This here is our album. This can be our release date. And this can be our duration here. Now let's take a look at this component. If we inspect, we see title, authors, album, release date, and duration. And of course, in our row component in Svelte, we've got the same props here: title, authors, album, release date, and duration. We can use those and fill out this component. And obviously, again, they don't match one-to-one. For example, the release date, we're returning a Unix timestamp as opposed to this string that we have here in Figma. But that eventually gets converted here in the front end. This isn't a necessity, and I think a lot of folks will often forgo this or maybe change the API here in Figma slightly to be a little bit more readable to designers. But I really, really believe that this is a great way to help that transition between design and development. And this also makes you talk to your developers, right? To figure out a shared API, you need to talk to your developers. You need to show them that you're willing to listen to them and their needs. And again, build that bridge between these two disciplines. And speaking of bridging between the two disciplines, I'm really excited to share that I'm going to be starting to work at Metafy as a technical designer / design engineer, maybe, who knows, which I'm super excited about. It's something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I'll be joining their team to work as this hybrid role between a designer and a developer, and doing the same thing, helping to bridge the gap between design and engineering, using code as sort of a surface for designs and prototyping. And yeah, I'll definitely learn a lot doing this and being in this position, really for the first time, at least officially. So I'll definitely report back later in the year with probably some updated tips and things that I've learned on components. And of course, throughout the year, I'll be diving deeper into this cross-functional world, not just to do with components, but with other things, with other tutorials and tips and things that I've learned, again, of bridging that gap between design and development. So if you do want to watch that, go ahead and hit subscribe. And of course, if you did like this video, please leave a like. Let me know in the comments what you liked or what you want to learn more about. And if you want to get access to my files and join my community and support the channel, you can join my Patreon at the link below. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in the next one. And until then, happy designing.